The infamous Eaton M90 Supercharger with mild porting running on 85 and a smaller 2.8 input pulley. It is fully capable of supporting around 400 crank horsepower in a 3.8 liter V6 engine. All of this in a small, potent, efficient, and economical package. Toys for Life. Now for the fun part. Let's put it back together. In the last video, I told you guys a lie. So we're gonna put these in a safe place where they can stay clean. You don't wanna try to take the carbon off. You don't wanna monkey with this at all. I ended up cleaning just about all of the carbon off the rotor pack. And the reason I did, I took a clean cloth, well, it was clean, and with no solvents or abrasives, it pretty much wiped off with very little effort. So I thought, why not? And the rotors are coated from the factory from Eaton, who makes the M90 Supercharger, with kind of a Teflon-like material. You can see where there's a little chip here where something must have hit along the years. Anyway, it wiped off super easy. I'm not sure if that had anything to do with it, but at the end of the day, they look almost new. I should probably mention here, I'm in kind of the snout area where the snout goes onto the rotor pack. Anyway, these are notorious. This is the coupler right here, and it's plastic, and it slides onto the pegs on these gears. And when I got this particular engine, it sounded like there was about 10 marbles inside the Supercharger. I was kind of convinced it was shot. Then I did my research and found out that when these couplers are bad, they sound like a bunch of marbles, go figure, bouncing around inside the Supercharger. So about 5 years ago or so, I replaced this coupler. It's a cheap part, I don't know, 10, 15 bucks, something like that. And it sounded like new. So just so you know, that coupler is an easy fix if it sounds like you have marbles in your Supercharger. Guys, as you may recall, we're going to have to shorten two of the bolts that attach the Supercharger snout to the Supercharger, and that's because we removed two of the bosses that the bolts go into, and if we don't shorten the bolts, they're just going to obstruct the flow. So what I'm going to do, I've just got a slide veneer caliper, and I'm going to use it to measure the distance between the head of the bolt and the Supercharger snout. And that's how much I've got to take off each of the two bolts. That looks pretty good. And it works just fine. Okay, as I mentioned before, I've got both of the Supercharger bearings nice and super clean. Now I'm going to pack them with grease. And this is some crazy, crazy grease. You get that much from either ZZ Performance or Intense Racing, but it's a really unique grease that has to handle, I don't know, like 15,000 RPM on those shafts that go on the bearings. Plus, the Supercharger gets from, 20 below in the winter, if the car was driven in the winter, to maybe 250 degrees in the summer. So it is the weirdest grease you'll ever see. So I'm going to go ahead and pack it into those bearings because they're clean, and I'm going to use my finger to work it in to try to get, kind of like packing wheel bearings. We'll get those fully greased, put some grease on the shafts, then I'll put anaerobic sealer on this flange, which I've got perfectly clean, and then we'll be able to throw the rotor pack in. I've got this screwdriver to help me get the grease into the holes. This is super clean. And it's just this really gooey grease. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean this flange one more time. And again, it's already been scraped and lightly sanded, as well as the flange on the snout. And we'll put the nose back on the Supercharger. Now we got to line up these 3 dowel pins with the coupler. And we'll get the bolt started. Again, making sure to put the 2 bolts that I shortened down in the bottom. Now it's time to break out the torque wrench, and I'm going to do these in 3 passes, starting out at 5 foot-pounds, about 12 foot-pounds, and then 18 foot-pounds. Then at each level, I'll do a crisscross pattern, but then I'll finish by just going clockwise all the way around to make sure that I properly torque each bolt. Now let's shift gears to the boost bypass valve, and we'll lean on the usual suspects, a little solvent and a Scotch-Brite pad to shine these up so they look almost like new, and we'll get these installed. But I want to point your attention to these screws. They're kind of pinched on the end, and Eaton must have somehow squished them after they were installed so that they don't fall out. I don't have that same ability, so I did have to use the grinder to kind of grind the tips off the corners a little bit to get them to thread back in. And I'm going to use some blue Loctite. And I clean these threads meticulously, as well as these, because Loctite will not work on greasy threads. It has to be clean metal. So let's go ahead and put this together. One thing I'm going to do is where this blow-off valve shaft rides in the case, I'm going to put it in the case, and then before it's all the way in, I'll put a little grease on the outside edge here and on the inside here, and shove it in the rest of the way. That way it's got some grease to pivot on. Let's do that now. Now let's go ahead and put the blow-off valve itself into the shaft and tighten it down with some blue Loctite. It's a little tricky getting the valve lined up, but a little bit of patience and you can do it. No problem. Now just put a little dab of Loctite on the end of the screw. A magnetic screwdriver would be ideal, but I don't seem to have one handy. Get it lined up in the hole. Same thing with the second screw. You could use red, but I'm afraid that if you had to take it back apart, you just strip out these Phillips heads, and that's kind of short-sighted. I think blue should be fine, but use your own judgment on that, because I don't want to be responsible for your motor if it has an issue. And there you have it. It's ready for operation.